It's Black History Month, so let's discuss a vase from ancient Greece that some people thought was racist. So the type of vase is called Janiform. It has two faces. One is white and one is black. And some people thought that meant that the Greeks were proto-racist, which in their own regard they did have prejudices. But this vase was made in the 5th and 6th century, and all of the evidence that people cited saying that this vase was racist was from later time periods. If you didn't know, my bachelor's degree is in classical civilization, and one time I wrote a 40-page art history final about this topic. In a book called Before Color Prejudice, a man named Frank Snowden, who is a classicist and a historian, asserts that ancient Greek peoples did not have the same kind of racism that we have today. A man named Benjamin Isaac wrote a book called The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity, and honestly, I think that he was inventing the racism that he saw because he wanted to justify further racism. A man named David Goldenberg wrote a lot of books about racism in classical antiquity and in biblical times, and he connects the biblical idea of black is bad and white is good, black is sin, white is pure. He connects that idea to ancient Greek art and culture. Goldenberg uses some evidence from a man named Juvenal, who was a Roman poet, but he was born in 55 CE, and he connects the ideas of racism in his poetry and works to classic Greek art from 5th century BCE. He also uses evidence from Aristotle's Physiognomics, which was written in the mid-4th century. Keep in mind, the art in question is from 2 centuries prior, but in any case, Aristotle describes that the Greeks are the perfect form in all ways, so this idea of proto-racism. Aristotle also described in a work called Politics how some people are just born of a naturally lower state of being. They're subordinate. Therefore, slavery is just natural. A man named Hippocrates also said that some people are just lesser beings because of the place that they were born. But again, this was written hundreds of years after the art began appearing. Herodotus, who wrote the histories, spent a lot of time in northern Africa, and he describes how aesthetically pleasing African faces were to the Greek people simply because they were so different. He didn't describe any kind of hierarchy based on skin color like some of the later Greek historians and philosophers. Greeks did have this idea of otherness in which somebody was different than them, and sometimes they did depict the other in a negative way, such as the centaurs, the Gauls, or the Persians. But they didn't depict African people in the same way as they did the other others. And when they depicted the other men, they depicted them in a feminine quality in order to degrade them further, but they didn't do the same with Africans. Anyways, these two-headed vases had a very striking dichotomy, white face with black features and black face with white features. And of course the Greeks were not as pale as me, right? They had tanness to their skin, but the artists purposefully whitewashed the face and then on the other side purposefully made it darker to give a striking dichotomy. As you might know, the ancient Greeks used a lot of vases, and many times vases were gifted to women because they used them all over the house to hold water, oil to wash themselves, perfumes, olive oil, and they had the vases on display in their homes. So a beautiful vase like the Janiform one is safe to assume that it was on display because it was aesthetically pleasing. Greek art and pottery tended to favor women for their beauty. It wasn't an objectification per se, but it still was. But it was like, look at this beautiful thing. They would put jewelry on the vases. They would sometimes put a hole through the ear of a vase and put an actual earring in it. If not, just make jewelry and adornments out of the clay. They would paint these vases and they would be on display. There's a Greek word for beauty, kalos, and on these Janiform vases, the artist would write kalos. There's no question that these vases were meant to signify beauty rather than a proto-racism.